The crisp autumn sunlight bathed the visitors' entrance to Buckingham Palace, where a diplomatic motorcade pulled to a smooth stop, its black vehicles gleaming like polished onyx. The door of the second car swung open before the driver could reach it, and Brigadier General Marcus Thornton emerged with the brisk efficiency of a man who lived by his own timetable. His uniform was immaculate, every medal and ribbon precisely placed, each crease sharp enough to draw blood. The 4 stars on his epaulettes catching the morning light. At 58, Thornton had spent 30 years commanding troops across 4 continents, his career marked by 2 tours in Afghanistan and a reputation for demanding absolute efficiency, 12 minutes behind schedule already. "Lieutenant," he muttered to the younger officer, scrambling out of the car after him. "Remind me why I agreed to this detour when the defense conference starts in 3 hours." Lieutenant Davis adjusted his own uniform hastily, his voice tinged with deference. The ambassador thought it would be a good diplomatic gesture. "Sir, the British contingent specifically requested your presence." "Diplomatic gestures," Thornton repeated, the words carrying a hint of disdain, as if they were a mild profanity in his mouth. "We could be finalizing the Baltic security briefing instead of touring what amounts to an expensive museum." His gaze swept across the palace grounds, not with the appreciation of a visitor, but with the calculating assessment of a tactician, noting vulnerabilities and patterns rather than history or beauty. A group of palace officials approached with welcoming smiles, their hands extended in greeting, and Thornton straightened his already perfect posture, slipping into what his staff privately called his diplomatic mode, all firm handshakes and precise courtesy that never quite reached his eyes. "General Thornton, what an honor to welcome you to Buckingham Palace." The lead official began, his voice warm with practiced hospitality. "The honor is mine," Thornton replied automatically, though his attention quickly shifted to the motionless figure of a royal guard standing at his post, the scarlet uniform brilliant against the palace stonework. "I see your famous guards are on duty," he remarked, his tone more observational than impressed. "Indeed, General, the Queen's Guard has maintained their post here for centuries," the official replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Maintaining tradition is commendable." Thornton interrupted, already losing interest in the historical lecture. "Though in today's security environment, I've always wondered about the tactical value of predictable positioning and ceremonial attire." The official's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "I assure you, General, despite their ceremonial role, each guard is a fully operational combat soldier." "Is that so?" Thornton said, his tone carrying polite skepticism. "Lieutenant," he addressed his aide without looking away from the guard, "inform the delegation. I'll rejoin them shortly. I'd like to observe these combat soldiers more closely." "Sir, the schedule will accommodate a small detour," Thornton finished firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Military assessment is never wasted time." "Lieutenant," as the palace officials led the rest of the delegation toward the formal entrance, Thornton set off at a purposeful stride toward the solitary guard, his path cutting across the carefully maintained grounds like a ruler's edge. Direct and unyielding, Royal Guard Patrick Winters had noticed the approaching motorcade long before it stopped, his 8 years of specialized training honing his peripheral awareness to near supernatural levels. Though his eyes remained fixed forward in the proper 1,000-yard stare, he registered every detail of the American general now approaching with unmistakable purpose. Just 3 weeks ago, Winters had been extracting a compromised intelligence asset from a hostile situation in Eastern Europe, an operation still classified at the highest levels. The seamless transition from active field operations to ceremonial duty was part of what made the Queen's Guard unique among military units. The rifles they carried weren't merely props, and the men who stood watch weren't simply trained to stand motionless. They were combat-ready soldiers, their ceremonial roles a testament to a tradition that dated back centuries, yet their skills honed for modern warfare. Among the gathering crowd of tourists, Winters noted a distinguished older gentleman in a tweed jacket, his military bearing evident in his posture. Observing the approaching general with a knowing expression. Winters assessed him automatically. Former military, high-ranking, likely British Army. Given his subtle reaction to the palace's changing of the guard announcement, the American general was closing the distance now, his expression a mixture of curiosity and faint disdain, and Winters mentally prepared for what experience told him was coming. Another test of his discipline, another attempt to provoke a reaction, another person who failed to understand that standing guard was not merely standing still, but a profound act of duty and focus. General Thornton dismissed his nervous aide with a curt gesture. "Rejoin the delegation. Lieutenant, tell them I'm conducting an informal inspection," he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty that his deviation from the schedule would be accommodated without question. "Yes, sir," Lieutenant Davis replied, hesitating briefly before adding, "Should I inform the British liaison officer about your inspection?" Thornton's expression hardened slightly. "That won't be necessary. Lieutenant, last I checked, observing public displays doesn't require diplomatic clearance." The lieutenant retreated hastily, leaving Thornton to approach the guard unaccompanied. Colonel Edward Blackwood, the retired British Army officer among the tourists, immediately recognized the potential for trouble. His 30 years in the service had taught him to spot the warning signs of military authority overstepping its boundaries, and he moved closer, ostensibly admiring a nearby plaque while keeping the interaction within earshot. Thornton circled the guard, his voice loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Interesting specimen," he remarked. "Theatrical, but impressive in its own way." A young American couple exchanged uncomfortable glances, the wife whispering to her husband, "Is he allowed to get that close?" Her husband shrugged uncertainly, both stepping back to create distance from what felt increasingly like an impending confrontation. Thornton completed his circuit, positioning himself directly in front of Guard Winters, deliberately occupying the space in his line of sight. "You know, in most militaries, we measure effectiveness by action rather than inaction," he projected, his voice carrying the tone of a lecture hall rather than a one-on-one exchange. Interesting cultural difference. He leaned slightly closer, examining the guard's uniform insignia with a critical eye. "Combat experience. According to these ribbons, I wonder if standing perfectly still feels like a proper use of that training." Colonel Blackwood's jaw tightened as he observed the deliberate provocation, and he caught the eye of a palace security officer, giving a subtle nod toward the situation. The officer acknowledged, with an equally discreet nod, speaking quietly into his radio. "I've commanded 3 forward operating bases," Thornton continued, each word precise and measured, "led combat operations on 4 continents, and never once did I train my men to stand motionless while being addressed by a superior officer." The emphasis he placed on superior left no doubt about his self-assessment. His tone honed through decades of giving orders that were immediately obeyed. Guard Winters remained perfectly still, his discipline absolute. The only movement, the slight flutter of a ribbon on his uniform as a breeze swept across the palace grounds. "At ease, soldier," Thornton said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Your brigadier general is addressing you. Perhaps they don't teach proper military courtesy in your training. In real combat units, acknowledging superior officers isn't optional. It's fundamental to the chain of command." Colonel Blackwood winced slightly at the phrase "real combat units," knowing how deeply insulting that would be to any Queen's Guard if they were permitted to respond. He glanced around, noticing other visitors with military bearing, a Dutch naval officer, a retired Canadian regiment commander, both watching with growing concern, their expressions reflecting the tension of a situation where military pride was colliding with diplomatic protocol. "You see this uniform," Thornton continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Before I earned the right to wear it, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I've watched brothers in arms fall, defending the values you mock. This isn't a costume, sir. It's a symbol of dedication that you clearly cannot comprehend." Thornton circled the guard once more, his measured steps echoing against the palace stonework, each footfall deliberate. Like a predator sizing up its prey. When he returned to face Guard Winters, his posture had shifted subtly, shoulders squared more aggressively, chin raised a fraction higher. In every military on Earth, he projected, his voice carrying to the gathered crowds. Soldiers salute superior officers. It's not merely courtesy. It's recognition of the command structure that keeps armies functional in chaos. He gestured to his insignia, the 4 stars gleaming on his epaulets. These stars represent authority recognized by NATO and every allied force, including Her Majesty's Armed Forces. Colonel Blackwood stepped closer to a family of American tourists who were watching with uncomfortable fascination, their young son tugging at his mother's sleeve. The guards follow a different protocol, Blackwood explained quietly, his voice steady with the weight of experience. They answer to the crown first. Their standing orders supersede even visiting generals. Then why doesn't someone tell him that? The American father whispered back, his brow furrowed with concern. Some lessons need to be learned firsthand. Blackwood replied, his tone carrying the weary wisdom of someone who had witnessed similar scenes before. This is precisely the problem with emphasizing tradition over tactical reality. Thornton continued, his words taking on the sharp edge of a battlefield command. A soldier who cannot adapt to circumstances becomes a liability. In any combat zone I've commanded, this kind of rigid adherence to protocol would get men killed. He moved closer still, his shadow falling across the guard's immaculate uniform, his presence dominating the space. Let me be perfectly clear. Soldier, your ceremonial role does not exempt you from basic military courtesy. When addressed by a superior officer, you acknowledge that officer. That's not British or American protocol. That's military fundamentals. Guard. Thornton's voice snapped across the courtyard like a whip crack. This is a direct order from a brigadier general. Render proper respect with a salute now. Each word landed with the precision of artillery fire, targeted and unyielding. The crowd collectively held its breath, the tension palpable in the crisp autumn air. Several people who had been recording the scene on their phones lowered them slowly, suddenly uncomfortable with documenting what felt increasingly like a diplomatic incident. Parents pulled their children closer, while military veterans among the spectators straightened unconsciously, responding to the unmistakable tone of command. Something dangerous flickered in Thornton's eyes, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his professional exterior. His right hand rose deliberately, hovering for a moment before settling firmly on the guard's shoulder. When a superior officer gives a direct order, Thornton said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, the only acceptable response is immediate compliance. The physical contact sent a ripple of shock through the observers, a boundary unmistakably crossed. Colonel Blackwood took a definitive step forward, his military bearing suddenly prominent. General, I must advise you. But before he could finish, Thornton continued, his fingers pressing into the scarlet uniform. I understand theatrical tradition. Soldier, what I don't understand is blatant disrespect to a NATO commanding officer. His voice carried absolute authority, the same tone that had directed troops through combat zones and commanded immediate obedience in crisis situations. A young boy's voice broke the tense silence, his tone innocent yet piercing. Mom, he's not supposed to touch the guard, is he? The question hung in the air, perfectly articulating the boundary that had been crossed. The shift in Guard Winter's demeanor came with such precise military discipline that several observers later described it as almost mechanical in its perfection. One moment he stood in ceremonial stillness. The next, his white-gloved hand moved with fluid efficiency to remove the general's grip from his shoulder. The movement was neither aggressive nor disrespectful, simply definitive, carrying the practiced precision of thousands of hours of drill, combined with the quiet authority of someone operating under absolute certainty of protocol. Sir, with respect, touching a queen's guard is forbidden under standing orders, Winters said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of British military authority, steady and unapologetic. My duty requires me to inform you of this violation and request you step back to the designated viewing area. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. General Thornton's expression shifted from commanding to momentarily stunned, then rapidly progressed to indignation. "You dare?" he began, but Winters continued with impeccable military courtesy that permitted no interruption. "Brigadier General Thornton, while your rank commands appropriate respect within NATO allied forces, current protocol on palace grounds establishes clear guidelines for interaction with the Queen's Guard. Physical contact with the guard on duty constitutes a Class 2 security breach, requiring immediate response." His gaze remained forward, still following ceremonial requirements, even as he addressed the situation. His voice unwavering. Standing Order 157 specifically addresses interaction with Allied military personnel. Guards will maintain position and bearing regardless of visiting military rank, as their oath is sworn first to the crown. Colonel Blackwood had moved to within a few paces, his military bearing evident as he addressed Thornton. "He's entirely correct, General. The Guards operate under the direct authority of the monarchy, not the NATO command structure. Their protocols supersede standard military courtesy within the palace grounds. My duty is to the crown first." Winters continued, his discipline evident in every perfectly chosen word. "That duty includes maintaining prescribed position, bearing, and protocol regardless of external military authority. This isn't a matter of disrespect to your rank, sir, but rather absolute respect for the oath we've sworn." General Thornton. A measured voice came from behind, authoritative without being confrontational. Captain James Edwards of the Queen's Guard approached with the steady stride of someone comfortable with both ceremonial precision and battlefield command. His uniform was identical to Winters, though subtle differences in insignia marked his rank. "I believe there might be some misunderstanding regarding protocol," he said, introducing himself with a crisp nod that acknowledged Thornton's rank without compromising his own authority. "Captain Edwards, Guard Company Commander, I understand you've been discussing protocol with Guard Winters. Your guard broke position to address me," Thornton stated, his tone suggesting this validated his earlier points about ceremonial rigidity versus practical response. "Indeed, sir," Captain Edwards replied smoothly, his delivery factual rather than defensive. Guard Winters followed Standing Order 157. Paragraph 3. In the event of physical contact or immediate security concerns, guards are authorized to respond with minimum necessary communication and action. Rather impressive adherence to protocol. Actually, he gestured toward a less crowded area of the grounds, his tone calm and professional. "Perhaps we might continue this discussion more privately. General, I'd be happy to explain the historical and practical considerations that govern our protocols here." As they moved away from the crowd, Captain Edwards began speaking in the measured tones of someone well-versed in explaining complex traditions to visitors. "The Queen's Guard appears ceremonial to most observers, but that's only one aspect of their function," he explained, his voice steady and assured. "Each guard is drawn from active combat units, the same soldiers who have served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other deployments. Winters himself was with Special Reconnaissance in Eastern Europe just last month." Something in Thornton's expression shifted as this information registered, a flicker of reassessment in his steely gaze. "Combat veterans," he acknowledged, his tone softening slightly as he processed the new perspective. "Indeed," Captain Edwards confirmed. "The ceremonial aspect is an additional duty, not their primary function. Their standing orders reflect this dual role, maintaining traditions that connect our military present to its historical foundations, while remaining combat-ready soldiers." They paused near a more private section of the palace grounds, the autumn leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Captain Edwards' next words were carefully chosen, his voice a balance of respect and authority. "When you addressed Guard Winters, sir, you weren't facing ceremonial pageantry, but rather a different command structure." His non-response wasn't disrespect, but adherence to standing orders that place sovereign authority above visiting military rank. Thornton's military discipline reasserted itself as he absorbed the explanation. His 30 years of command experience teaching him the value of adapting to new information, even when it challenged his assumptions. "I appreciate the clarification, Captain," he said, his tone shifting from confrontational to professionally engaged. "In 30 years of service, I have encountered many different military traditions, though none quite so particular in their protocol." Colonel Blackwood approached, offering his hand to General Thornton, his presence a bridge between the tension of the moment and the shared camaraderie of military service. "Edward Blackwood, formerly Colonel, 5th Royal Regiment," he said, his tone conversational, but carrying the weight of experience. "I served alongside American forces in the Gulf." Thornton accepted the handshake with professional courtesy, the gesture grounding him in the mutual respect of their shared history. "If I might add, General," Blackwood continued, "what you witnessed with Guard Winters was precisely the discipline that makes these soldiers exceptional in combat situations. The same focus that keeps them motionless for hours enables them to maintain position under enemy fire when necessary." Thornton considered this perspective, his tactical mind engaging with the concept, the gears of his strategic thinking turning. "Different application of the same discipline," he acknowledged, his voice thoughtful. "Exactly so," Captain Edwards confirmed, his tone warm with the pride of his unit. "Many of our guards have transferred those same skills to special operations, where patience and absolute control are essential. The ceremonial duties appear anachronistic to some, but they build fundamental combat disciplines that serve modern warfare quite effectively." A small group of schoolchildren passed by, pointing excitedly at Guard Winters' perfect stillness, their teacher explaining in hushed tones about the tradition and what it represented. Thornton watched the children's fascination, a flicker of understanding softening his stern features. "Tradition has its place," he conceded, his voice quieter now. "Reflective, as do we," Captain Edwards replied smoothly, "but adaptability itself takes different forms. For us, it includes maintaining historic continuity while deploying the same personnel to modern conflict zones, often transitioning between those roles within the same month." Thornton nodded thoughtfully, his perspective shifting further. "Different expressions of the same military principles," he mused, his voice carrying a newfound respect. As they walked toward the location of the upcoming ceremony, Thornton glanced back at Guard Winters, seeing him now through a more informed lens. The guard stood as he had before, his scarlet uniform a beacon of tradition, his stillness a testament to a discipline Thornton now understood in a deeper way. "Your guard handled the situation with admirable restraint," Thornton admitted, his tone genuine. "Many would have responded more aggressively to my approach. They're selected as much for their judgment as their discipline," Captain Edwards explained, his voice tinged with pride. "Each guard makes dozens of instant decisions daily. Which protocol violations require response, which can be handled with minimal intervention, and which demand immediate action. Combat decision-making applied to a ceremonial context." Thornton's military mind continued processing the lessons of the encounter as they waited for the ceremony to begin. The first notes of ceremonial music drifting through the air, signaling the approaching guard change. He stood at parade rest, his posture unconsciously reflecting a newfound respect for a military tradition different from, yet fundamentally aligned with, his own. The incident rippled beyond the palace grounds in ways Thornton could not have anticipated. News of the encounter spread through military circles, becoming a topic of discussion at the defense conference he'd been scheduled to attend. British and American officers debated the balance between tradition and adaptability. The story of Guard Winters Sawar's response, sparking conversations about the universal values that bind soldiers across nations: discipline, duty, chain of command. In a small Virginia town, Eleanor Grayson, a 70-year-old widow whose husband had served in Vietnam, heard the story from a friend who'd been at the palace that day. Eleanor's husband, Tom, had always admired the British military's precision, often telling her stories of joint operations during his service. She sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, As she listened to the tale of the American general and the Queen's Guard, it reminded her of Tom's belief in the importance of understanding different military cultures, a lesson he'd learned during his time in Southeast Asia, where miscommunication between allies could cost lives. Eleanor shared the story with her veterans group, the room falling silent as she recounted Guard Winter's steadfast adherence to protocol, a symbol of the loyalty Tom had valued so deeply. The group decided to write a letter to the household division, expressing their admiration for the Queen's Guard and their traditions, a small gesture of solidarity that bridged the Atlantic. Guard Winters continued his duties in the weeks that followed, his encounter with General Thornton becoming a quiet legend among his peers. The story was told and retold in the barracks, a reminder of the delicate balance between tradition and diplomacy, and the strength required to uphold one's oath in the face of pressure. Winters himself rarely spoke of the incident, but when a young recruit asked him about it during a training session, he offered a simple reply. "Duty isn't about who's watching," he said, his voice steady as ever. "It's about who you've sworn to serve." The recruit nodded, the lesson sinking in. A new generation of guards, learning from the example set that autumn morning. General Thornton returned to the United States a changed man, though he'd never admit it outright. At the defense conference, he spoke briefly of his time at Buckingham Palace, his tone more reflective than his colleagues expected. Tradition and adaptability aren't opposites. He told a room of NATO officers, his voice carrying the weight of experience. They're two sides of the same coin, different expressions of the same principles that make us soldiers. His words were met with nods of agreement. The story of his encounter with the Queen's Guard spreading further, a testament to the power of mutual understanding in a world often divided by differences. Years later, a small plaque was placed near the visitors' entrance to Buckingham Palace, a subtle tribute to the guards who stood watch with unwavering discipline. It read, "In honor of the Queen's Guard, whose duty to the crown reflects the universal values of military service." Tourists often paused to read it, their voices hushed as they spoke of the Guard's storied history, their role as both soldiers and symbols. On a quiet afternoon, a retired General Thornton visited the palace again, his hair now gray, his uniform replaced by a simple suit. He stood before the plaque, his hands clasped behind his back, a faint smile on his lips as he remembered that autumn day. He'd learned a lesson in respect that had stayed with him, a reminder that true authority comes not from demanding obedience, but from understanding the oaths that others have sworn to uphold.